Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm your host, Alexander Ath, and today we are so excited to welcome back to the podcast Samuel David to discuss Mesopotamian esotericism in his latest tome from Anathema Publishing entitled The Red Shepherd. Now, I know that many of you listeners are familiar with Samuel and his work. Samuel is among many other things, a Mesopotamian polytheist, an artist, a writer, a researcher, and an educator based in the American Midwest. And he's also a representative of Temple Sangamon. Samuel's been on the podcast before to talk about his book, Rodandring, one of his first books, an initiation into a Mesopotamian mystery tradition. But in Samuel's latest tome, The Red Shepherd from Anathema Publishing, it is so multifaceted and so deep because it explores this equally mysterious but also just powerful deity, Dumuzid or Tammuz, who is, among many other things, a pastoral deity guarding the sheepfold. But also, as Samuel says, Dumuzid is a king, a high priest, a warrior, a captain of the host, and a commander of chariots, a god who stands at the gates of heaven, and so many more attributes. And so when it comes to Mesopotamian esotericism, how can we engage with this deity? And what are the rites and offerings that are needed in order to better understand and engage with this powerful god? Well, Samuel David, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast because you are the best person to ask.
Well, thank you so much for having me again. It's good to see you face to face, and hopefully I can share some pearls of wisdom this time without laughing at every single thing I said, because, I do like to tell dad jokes. That is one of my many flaws. So if you're out there and you want to play a drinking game, just take a shot every single time I A, tell a dad joke, and B, laugh at my own dad jokes.
Well, we are going to get very inebriated in this episode, I might say, listeners. So please get ready for that. And Samuel, too, I have to say, before we get to the dad jokes, your book, The Red Shepherd, it was not only an honor to read, it was an honor to write the foreword to this book, because just like in the last podcast, you were, for me, one of the initial movers behind illuminating this amazing tradition, this Mesopotamian esoteric tradition for ritual offerings, necromantic procedures, a praxis of descending into the underworld, the rod and ring. You are truly someone who has helped me understand this just mysterious aspect of history. And also, because of you, I started learning Sumerian, and so I both thank you for that, but I also am very tired because of that. So thank you for that. By the way, in addition to the Digital Hammurabi channel, which I think you would be a fantastic guest, because their book as well, Learning to Read Sumerian, is such a fantastic book, and it was because you were the first person to inspire me to learn Sumerian. So before we get into all of this, though, Samuel, tell us about The Red Shepherd, because you opened the book with a place that I think a lot of people might not expect, which is you opened the book referencing the Bible. You say, quote, "I was perhaps 7 years of age when I read the words 'weeping for Tammuz' in the King James Bible, words that struck a chord within me, along with so many others that piqued my curiosity about polytheism in the ancient Near East," unquote. So can you tell us a little bit about the biblical reference and just what questions did this bring up for you?
Yeah, sure. So, as you mentioned, because you read the manuscript and wrote the preface, which I thank you so much for. There we go. Take a shot. I couldn't help but think, as I was compiling all the research, why this research was so pivotal to me, and why this was something that I personally needed to explore. And as I'm writing it, I just keep thinking back to, my formative years where as a child growing up Pentecostal, and the King James version was the preferred version because it's the only true word of God, as many have purportedly said. I was reading the Bible during a sermon that had nothing to do, what I was reading, of course, had nothing to do with the sermon. And I was a fan, you could say, of the Hebrew Old Testament because of the larger than life heroes, the wild and crazy, wacky adventures of individuals like Samson, and the prophet, my namesake, the prophet Samuel, and my other namesake, the King David. So I'm reading all these things and being exposed to polytheism at an early age. I'd like to say that the Bible is my gateway drug to polytheism, paganism, the occult in general. And as I read those passages that were found in the book of Ezekiel, weeping for Tammuz, and there's mention of the abomination that occurs in the in the temple, and priests worshiping the sun and the stars and the moon. And I just thought, what is it about this that's piquing my curiosity? As an adult now, I look back at that thinking, this impressionable child, and what is this impressionable child going to grow up to be? And reading those words, weeping for Tammuz, and then later in other passages of the Bible, in the book of Jeremiah, where the prophet Jeremiah pretty much puts the people of Judah and Israel on blast and says that you're no longer worshiping the Lord your God, you are doing X, Y, Z. And then the women retort that since they put off worshiping the Queen of Heaven and burning incense in her name, pouring out libations, baking cakes in her honor, they've known nothing but warfare and famine and starvation and turmoil. And I thought, if this is the case for these individuals who don't worship the Most High God, what makes them so bad? And I was later exposed to the work of Alexander Hislop, which I go into detail about in the book, and of course the pivotal tome that many who wish to reconcile the disparities between known history and biblical history would be Halley's Handbook, or Halley's Handbook for the Bible. And that was my second Bible, if you will, because it shed light, at least it shed light on what I had access to at that time, which pretty much portrayed these non-Hebrew people as horrible monsters, but horrible monsters who nonetheless continue to pique my curiosity and drew me out of the fold of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ into the fold of another God. So there's your long and short answer.
Well, you know what? I remember when I was talking with you, and I remember when I was talking with Dr. Irving Finkel when he was on the podcast about, research and scholarship into these deities. And, you might think about Inanna, or, Ereshkigal, or you may think about the sun god, Utu. There's so many different deities in ancient Mesopotamian religion and magical practice. But when it comes to this specific deity, as you mentioned, weeping for Tammuz, this has to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, Samuel, one of the most paradoxical and just multifaceted deities in the Mesopotamian tradition. For example, you say, quote, "I present to you a god who not only descends into the underworld, but also ascends into heaven. I present you a liminal power that stirs life into being, a power that simultaneously inhabits and eschews feminine and masculine spaces, a power that embodies passion and love and war, and ecstasy and sorrow, a power that defies the agony of death and secures a place as a regent in the underworld." I mean, this is just a menagerie of attributes. So I guess the best question is, Samuel, why is this god, Dumuzid or Tammuz, so multifaceted and so paradoxical. Like, what is going on here?
Well, not only is he paradoxical, there's this common thread among Assyriologists, at least Assyriologists of their day. We have scholars like Black and Green who wrote a phenomenal text about the deities, demons, and spirits of the ancient Near East. And repeatedly, they refer to him as a bewildering god. And I think that bewildering is the term that's ascribed to him because in any single narrative or hymn or exorcistic text that he is mentioned, his role changes, his identity as a whole changes, who his father is changes. And of course, one thing is consistent. He is a astral, terrestrial, and chthonic deity. But there's still more to any deity like that. And, we see parallels, I think. We see parallels with the goddess Hecate, who is, at the forefront, if you will, of the occult movement, of neo-paganism now, of polytheism. We have authors like Sarita Deste, we have authors like Jack Grail, who have written extensively about this goddess and presented both her benevolent and her wholly astral and divine, her role as a divine savior, but then also her associations with the darker things in life, her associations with darker forms of magic that are elaborated upon in the PGM. And as I'm reading all of these various translations and these various texts and these various academic papers, that's one thing. A lot of the work that I do, a lot of my comprehension, a lot of my own personal praxis is informed by academia, and all of these academics expound upon the same thing, that he has his fingers in so many different pies. And so we have a god who in some instances is a youthful shepherd. We have a god who in some instances is the virile lover. We have a god in some instances who, despite the fact that he is married to a passionate powerhouse, he decides to get it on with another woman who unfortunately is executed for her crimes of adultery. Not Dumuzid. His paramour is executed. Then we also have his interesting, albeit taboo, relationship with his own sister, which is elaborated upon in the text. But ultimately, what fascinates me is his overlooked role in magic and exorcism and love spells. And in fact, if you will, I would like to read a passage that really piqued my interest in all of this. And this is from Before the Muses, an anthology of Akkadian literature by Benjamin R. Foster, or compiled by him and edited by him. But this is a text that is essentially described as a devotional or ritual poem. And what's interesting is, as you're reading the text, there are specific passages that are at the forefront. And, again, we have his presentation as the shepherd, but then it goes into something more elaborate. So it begins, "O Lord Dumuzid, awe-inspiring shepherd of Anu, lover of Ishtar the queen, eldest son of Nudimmud." Nudimmud is Enki, or Yah. That's one of his epithets. "O mighty one, leader without rival, who eats pure loaves baked in embers, who is clad in a cloak and carries a staff, who drinks water from a water skin. Creator of everything, Lord of the sheepfold." Now, sheepfold is synonymous with the kingdom, with the city as a whole, because you have shepherds who, in the Near East, in the ancient Near East, in Egypt, in the Levant, who have these pastoral attributes, because the sheep are the people of the city, the king is the shepherd. Goes on to state, "You are the lofty prince, the noble one. Drive away from me the evil gazer, the worker of evil, who has fixated upon me and is trying to cut short my life. Herewith I bring you my life. I hand him over to an evil spirit, a merciless demon. Let him be cut off from me. Grant me life. Tear out the evil gazer who is present in my body. Let me sound your praises until the end of my days." And what's interesting is later versions of this hymn substitute a name of a specific being, Humba or Humba, which one might think, oh, it's Humbaba, but two separate beings. So there's that there. So in this text, we have evidence, I would say, of a God who is far above and beyond the role, far above and beyond this identity that he's ascribed in myth, where he's, essentially a helpless victim, if you will. He's subject to the circumstances of fate, of his own poor decision making, and subject to the whims of his incredibly powerful wife. But if you look at all of these attributes that are ascribed to him, he and Inanna, or Ishtar in Akkadian mythology, Babylonian mythology, and texts, they are rather complementary in the sense that they inhabit all of these different domains. They embody but also eschew feminine and masculine spaces, because we have Inanna as not just a priestess of heaven or as the great redemptrix, but we also have her as a woman dressed in men's armor, possessing maces and swords and all of the regalia that is associated historically with masculinity, because these symbols, the mace specifically, was the symbol of masculinity, just as the brooch was the symbol of femininity. And in some instances, we have Inanna depicted with a beard to embody and present her in a way that blurs these gender lines. And one thing that I found interesting about Dumuzid's role in myth and in literature and in ritual is that not only does he have these very masculine qualities as a warrior, as a king, as commander of the gates and chariots, but there's an interesting parallel in the sense that and this is based on history, this is not based on modern conceptions of gender and orientation and what we know today, informed by our modern conceptions and social mores. But he possesses and exhibits these traits that make him rather effeminate. He doesn't stand on his own. He has to rely on his brother-in-law. He has to rely on his father-in-law. So his brother-in-law being Utu or Shamash, his father-in-law being the lunar god Nana or Sin, with his brother-in-law. If you look at certain passages of their myth or these liturgical texts, which are classified as hymns when really they could be read as mythology, you find these instances where their relationship is akin to the relationship that David and Jonathan have in the Hebrew Old Testament in the book of Samuel. I can't remember if it's the first or second, but there are these instances where these pledges are made and these acts are undertaken, where essentially Utu, as the benefactor, if you will, and the sponsor, if you will, of Dumuzid, who's pretty much presenting Dumuzid as someone who is worthy of Inanna's attention, worthy of Inanna's recognition as someone who is her peer, her equal. So you're reading that, or I'm reading that, and I'm thinking there's some interesting parallels here. There's an interesting way that he's being portrayed. And of course, so much is lost in translation because, as you know, as I know, Sumerian is not a language that can be easily translated. You've got all of this context, you've got all of this nuance that at the end of the day, once it's translated into English, it's like, it still doesn't make sense. So we kind of have to dumb it down in order for the reader, in order for us as the translators to fully comprehend what's being written. But, going back to your original question, we have this multifaceted God who, is effeminate, who is unable to care for himself, who's portrayed as somewhat feminine. We also have this God who inhabits these wild, bewildering roles as a king, as a priest, as the chief exorcist, the son of Enki. One thing that I do want to mention, and this is after I've traded notes with another friend, Shea Belay, who has written a wonderful text, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Left-Hand Path. And we often trade notes when it comes to mythology or specifically Mesopotamian lore as a whole, and how it's often represented in the Left-Hand Path community. And what I found interesting is that you have Dumuzid, who is somewhat of a Luciferian figure in the sense that in one myth in which he is featured, the figure Adapa, or the sage Adapa, who is understood by many to be, quote unquote, the Sumerian Adam, possesses divine knowledge, but he's still human. So as a human, he does not possess eternal life as a god would, but he has eternal knowledge. And when he presents himself before the gods to account for a divine act that he has done that defies divine order, Dumuzid is his sponsor and his advocate and says, essentially, he has the knowledge of the gods. Let him be given the food of the gods so that he can become one of us.
Yeah.
So there's these subtle inferences there that, I really hope that, as someone who is a celebrant of these Mesopotamian mysteries, these traditions, who wants to see a resurgence or a renaissance in the world as an alternative to other spiritual expressions that people may not necessarily gravitate towards because of, misgivings or the way it's perceived as a whole. I'm really hoping that this piques their interest, especially among those of us who, don't want to be nailed down to one specific facet of esotericism, polytheism, what have you, who want a god who isn't just one thing. They want a god or goddess who is multifaceted, who is a multifaceted gem instead of just, a one-dimensional figure, if you will.
Oh, I think that really does hit to the heart of exactly just this constellation of attributes and responsibilities and apparent contradictions and everything that really fuels the Red Shepherd, your latest tome. And to that very point, Samuel, you were mentioning about translations earlier and how sometimes, the way that it's conveyed in English is a little bit, obviously it has to be tweaked. It's different. And so to that point, we have a listener question for you from Hannah. And Hannah is asking and saying, "Hi, Samuel. I'm so excited to pick up a copy of The Red Shepherd. My question is, what historical source material do you use in your latest book? Do you have direct translations, or because of your experience as a practitioner of Mesopotamian esotericism, do you have texts that you were inspired to write yourself? Thank you."
It's an excellent question. Thank you, Hannah. And the answer to that question is both. So, as I'd mentioned earlier, a great deal of my praxis is informed by historical texts. And it's not so much because I want to be perceived as a Reconstructionist. At one time, that was a title that I ascribed to myself. But what's interesting about Reconstructionism is, and this is my opinion, so this is going to be subject to interpretation. And if I get, blasted in the comments, of course I'll defend myself or retreat to my cave. What I find fascinating about Reconstruction is it appears to focus on one specific period in time. And I had a conversation with Shawnee Oates when I interviewed her for Anathema's Bibliosophia channel. And she was talking about how instead of Reconstructionism, the drive should be the continuation of cult, meaning the gods, their spiritual practices that surround these gods, the cultural understanding that worshipers have about these gods evolves over time. History accounts to that. Synchronization happens. We typically view, at least those of us who have a more orthodox opinion when it comes to these things, syncretism is a bad word, but it's a historical fact that this happened. So I like to keep that in mind, and I like to stay informed because I don't want to be an individual who purports something to be truth or factual when really I'm just another clown in the world of clowns who is just reading and interpreting and digesting the material. So I don't want to be seen as, an expert on par with, individuals like Megan and Dr. Josh on Digital Hammurabi, or the incredible Dr. Irving Finkel. I'm just a normal human being. But back to the question that Hannah had. Yes, I do look to historical source material, and that is historical source material that is compiled by the likes of individuals like Benjamin Foster with his Before the Muses, Thorkild Jacobson's numerous texts. In fact, the one that you have behind you, behind that other book that I wrote, The Harps That Once, which is a wonderful text. And of course, it's that material, it's my own understanding of Mesopotamian literature, specifically liturgical texts, that informs my praxis. And for those who are familiar with the historical iterations and the way these passages were historically written, there is a great deal of similarity. And I don't want to say that as though my material is redundant. I'm hoping that I am able to resurrect the style of writing that was popular in its day. And it would be the changing repetitions or the material that's referred to as dialogue compositions. So I really want to stress that it's not all UPG. It is informed personal gnosis. And, in the midst of that, there's also instances where, UPG or unverified personal gnosis, even shared personal gnosis, because many of my peers, we've all had these similar experiences. But there are these instances where I have synchronicities or dreams, and I'll file it away. And in fact, in a particular portion of the book, I write and expound upon a ritual that was essentially revealed to me by two spirits. And what's interesting is, with the assistance of Seth Gonzalez, who I consulted with for the transliterations of my text, the names that these spirits gave to me were actually consistent with the God under whom they serve, which I found incredibly fascinating and also kind of scary, because there's always that part of any individual who engages with the esoteric, coming at it from a spirit model, that sometimes we catch the attention of something that we did not expect. And when it happens, we find ourselves questioning our place in the esoteric realm. So yeah, long and short of it.
Yeah, that again, that's so wonderful, because it really just goes to show that when you're engaging directly, to quote Terence McKenna, that felt presence of direct experience, it really goes directly to what you're talking about. And I think because you've kind of traced out so far for us, Samuel, this, multifaceted, paradoxical, complex menagerie of attributes that Dumuzid has, that the Red Shepherd has. You also then, in the book, you also explore and share different ways that the reader can come into contact with the Red Shepherd. And to that point, you share many different rites. One of them that I found it would be great to talk about is a rite sharing and asking the Hound of Dumuzid for guidance and for petitions. So could you share with listeners who might not be too familiar, what is the relationship between the Hound of Dumuzid and the god's role as a shepherd and a protector of the sheepfold?
Yeah, sure. So what's interesting about hounds, or dogs in particular as a whole, within the world of the Mesopotamians, dogs were very liminal creatures. And they were often described or ascribed demonic attributes. And that's not demon in the sense that we think of it today, but it's daemon, as in a spirit or being who possesses both the capacity to do evil and the capacity to do good. And what's interesting is the cultural conception of these creatures place them in a role in which we don't find, at least from what I understand, we don't find being very prevalent in later antiquity, because especially in the Middle East, dogs are considered unclean. And, even among certain European cultures, I believe it's the Roma, certain cultural mores and societal attitudes towards dogs are quite negative, because dogs are able to reach places of their body that are considered unclean. So we have these liminal creatures, we have these dirty dogs, if you will. But while they inhabited these liminal spaces, while they were ascribed these various traits, they were also pivotal in the role of warfare, their role within the context of warfare, because they accompanied kings, they accompanied warriors. We have numerous reliefs, Assyrian reliefs, depicting these dogs as quite ferocious. And what's interesting is these depictions are of mastiffs. And as you know, as some viewers and listeners may know, mastiffs are not exactly small teacup-sized dogs. These are pretty large dogs. In fact, the dog that I had before he passed away, he was a mastiff mix, and he was quite brutal and quite ferocious at times. And I say that jokingly, of course, but these were dogs. These were creatures that were perceived as ferocious, as mercurial as the gods in which they served. But they also accompanied shepherds. They also were found near the thrones of kings. And in fact, another deity, Gula or Bao, who's known by many names, she has a constellation of deities and attributes. And she is, analogous to the goddess Hecate, but she is always accompanied by dogs. And it was believed that despite all of these aspects of dogs, they also aided in healing, because it was believed that their saliva contributed to the healing factor whenever there was a wound, because they were, of course, they're seen licking their wounds. And, it was believed that by that transference, that's how healing occurred. which leads into a whole other tangent when it comes to saliva and spittle. But we can cross that bridge when we get there. But we have this relationship with dogs that is very much like our own today. They're companions, they're guardians, they are members of law enforcement, if you will. So it's a quite multifaceted role when it comes to these creatures. And of course, we have this age old conundrum as far as where the relationship between humans and dogs began and how it evolved. But I don't know if I'm answering the question. I feel like I've gone off on a tangent of my own, because it's like, let's talk about dogs. Okay.
No, that's great. I mean, and so to follow your point, it sounds like that those aspects of guarding, protecting, and when you think about the sheepfold and protecting from threats, and as you said earlier, the sheepfold is kind of a metaphor for the greater, city state, the greater community and organization. It sounds like, would it be fair to say that the dog itself just is an emissary or a manifestation of Dumuzid, and basically there's just such an intimate relationship between
absolutely and in fact, in the myth of Inanna's descent, where Dumuzid is being pursued, and in fact another myth where it's a standalone myth of Dumuzid's death, there's a specific passage that refers to his dogs as exacting vengeance. So, we've got that passage there. And in fact, I'd like to read that passage that is utilized in this text. And pardon my keystrokes. One moment here.
And so this is a passage directly relating to the Hound of Dumuzid and
yes.
that relationship. Okay.
Correct. So this is found in the adaptation that I wrote concerning Dumuzid's death. And, this is derived from historical sources. This is not a copy paste, because I don't want to be accused of plagiarism. Because we know what happens to people who plagiarize. So within the context of this myth, we have two figures. We have Yeshtinana, who is Dumuzid's sister, who swears an oath that she will not reveal his hiding place as he tries to escape his pursuers. And her oath is, if I reveal your hiding place, may your dog devour me. The black dog, your shepherd dog, the noble dog, your lordly dog, may your dog devour me.
Wow.
So these were not light oaths that were taken. And, this was an oath that she upheld, because later in the myth, she is tortured by his would-be captors, and she doesn't reveal his whereabouts, whereas an unknown or unnamed friend who also pledges that same oath, finally spills the beans, because the pursuers, the demons of the underworld, are like, look, if you tell us where he is, we're going to give you the field and all of its wheat. We're going to give you, a river of pure water. I mean, how can you pass those things up when you're living in an arid land?
Right, absolutely. And when you were reciting that, I mean, it really, you can feel the immediacy. You can feel that, it really brings it to life. There's a visceral reaction that you have to that, very tangible. And I think this, Samuel, follows in your book, The Red Shepherd. You have so many just fascinating compositions that you share about the different aspects of Dumuzid. And so, speaking of other selections of your book, can you share with us, I found this fascinating, about the Alalu bird. What is the Alalu bird and its relationship to Dumuzid? And then there's also a section that really stuck with me in your book that's entitled The God Takes Wing, that if you could share a little bit about that and just the relationship with this bird to Dumuzid.
Sure. So the reference to the Alalu bird is actually found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So in the epic, Ishtar, or Inanna, is essentially wooing Gilgamesh. And within the context of myth, and within the context of liturgy and history, there's this historical precedent. Inanna isn't just a goddess of sexuality and warfare and passion. She is also, and I'm going to court controversy when I say this, she is also the figurehead of patriarchy. She is the legitimizer of patriarchy. Without Inanna's blessing, one could not be a king. So basically, within this myth, within this narrative, she's essentially offering herself up to Gilgamesh and saying, be my husband, I'll make you king. And he rebuffs her, which is, leading to a whole other part of his epic. But he rebuffs her and then reminds her of every single individual that she loved and what happened to that individual. So in that passage, he refers to Dumuzid or Tammuz as the Alalu bird whose wings she broke, the Alalu bird being confined to the forest, crying out, "My wing, my wing." What's interesting about this bird, it is theorized to be the European blue roller, also known as the Indian roller. And this is a beautiful bird, has incredible plumage, and it's often described as the blue jay, but it's not, what we know here in the West, in the US. It's an incredibly beautiful bird, and it's from the same family as ravens, and it's known as an ambush predator. And what I found interesting about this bird is its preferred food of choice are snakes and scorpions, as well as insects and small prey like mice. And this does have parallels within Dumuzid's own liturgical texts, within his own exorcistic texts, where he is striking at demons or driving demons away. And this is one of those instances where it blurred the line between verified personal gnosis, unverified personal gnosis, shared personal gnosis, as well as historical texts and translations. And the more I studied this bird, the more it resonated with me. And, there are numerous instances that we find within Mesopotamian literature. The Mesopotamians cataloged everything. Like, we think that Excel spreadsheets are the bane of our existence. They would love these things. They would love the innovations that we have today with the horror that is Excel, because of their tabulations and their massive, lists, these ridiculous lists in many instances. But they wrote at great length about birds and about other creatures. So they would know specifically what the attributes of this bird were or are. So the attributes of this bird, as I mentioned, they're ambush predators. They are not just beautiful, but they are also predators. They're quite efficient. They don't have a pleasing song, though. They have a very garrulous voice. And in fact, if you Google or search them on YouTube, the sound of their bird call, it's almost like a clap. It's like two pieces of wood striking together, and it's a very percussive sound. And that's also something that I utilize in this text as a reference to the sound that the bird makes. And we find instances in other exorcistic texts where sound is used to drive off spirits, to drive off demons. And this is found throughout the world. This is even found within Western traditions, within Christianity. Drums are used during praise and worship, and building all this energy and percussive instruments. So that's something I explored at great length. And if you would permit me, I'd like to read a passage from the manuscript if I can find it, because my gosh, there's so many different rituals in here. You would think a madman.
And you know, while you find that, Samuel, too, I mean, it really is just one of those examples to me going through the Red Shepherd of exactly, you have this mix of just wonderful historical source material and also inspiration, results from your direct praxis, a way that you organize those traditional elements, you know, which we'll get into ritual offerings and incense and specific incantatory procedures. And so I think it's for anyone who will go through your book, they'll really find it refreshing that you present these different attributes of Dumuzid, but in a very poetic, ritualistic format. It's just great.
Well, I certainly hope so. You know, your mouth to God's ears. So, in this specific passage where I've written, the title is the Alalu bird, and then there's a brief description. A percussive instrument may be used throughout to simulate the short, repeated gruff call of the bird, identified as a brew roller. And then, of course, one should light a candle, prepare a bowl of clean water, a sprig of juniper. These things were historically attested as means to purify a space. So the passage begins with Dumuzid stretches forth his hands as wings. His pinions are as blue jasper. His cry is as the sound of falling stones. He seizes the tail of the serpent and the venomous mouth of the snake. He descends and ascends at the command of the gods of heaven and the gods of the underworld. Dumuzid stretches forth his hands as wings. His feathers are as agate. His flight is as the Sakal serpent gliding over the mountains. He snatches up that which would harm another. He descends and ascends at the command of gods of heaven and the gods of the underworld. Dumuzid stretches forth his hands as wings. His plumage is as lapis lazuli. His strike is as a spear thrown from on high. He carries his prey to his nest. He descends and ascends at the command of the gods of heaven and the gods of the underworld. And that is just one part of the text, but you know, I'll leave that as a sample of what the readers can expect.
I think that's lovely. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's one of, yes, just I mean dozens and dozens of different aspects that you share about. And to that very point, actually, Samuel, you mentioned about specific praxis elements being attested to in historical sources. And we do have a listener question for you from Half Metal Alchemist. I love the name, by the way. And Half Metal Alchemist is saying and asking, Samuel, I know many Mesopotamian rituals might involve offerings of flour and the burning of juniper, for example. My question is, when trying to contact the Red Shepherd, is there a process that you follow of opening a rite, closing a rite, maybe burning a specific kind of incense and offerings? Any praxis aspects that you have would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Half Metal Alchemist. The short answer is yes, I follow an opening rite, a closing rite. I use specific magica materia, if you will. And it's been a while because I haven't done major workings for people. And in fact, most of my workings now are pretty much are found within the realm of divination. But any major workings that I undertake will involve the use of flour, not only as an offering, but as a means to create a boundary. And it can be barley flour, it can be wheat flour. The type of flour really, at this day and age where, you know, everything is cleaned and processed in such a way, it really doesn't matter because we don't have to worry about, you know, bugs, and we don't have to worry about mold. So in addition to that water, I use purified water. And in fact, the purified water that I use is actually water drawn from the local river that lends its name to the region in which I live. So there's that element that is echoing the historical tradition or historical praxis. So I also use juniper, dried juniper berries, cedar, those plants were sacred to the gods. In fact, juniper was described historically as a plant whose smoke pervades the halls of heaven, the earth, and the underworld. It was considered the divine remediator. So it's the burning of that plant was supposed to be pleasing to the gods. And of course, we have cedar, which was utilized by gods such as Utu or Shamash, also known as Shamash, the god Ishkor, who is also known as Adad, because those two deities oversaw specific aspects of rituals such as purification rites, divinatory rites. So this was their sacred tree. As far as other offerings, of course, there's the offering that I most prefer, since I don't have alcohol in the house, and the heavy cream mixed with milk, because, you know, who doesn't love a sweet beverage? And of course, it would also consist of offerings like stick incense, and my preferred form of incense, of course, being frankincense resin, because there's nothing like the aromatic smell of frankincense resin, especially when you burn it in heavy quantities in your home, and it not only stays within the room that it's being utilized, it just gets in the vents, and then the next thing you know, it's all over the house. So hey, why not? You're purifying your entire house while you're at it.
Absolutely, yes. Nothing says purification exactly like a lovely amount of either juniper or, hey, frankincense, myrrh, just cascading through the house. Absolutely.
Can I not see because I've set things on fire?
Well, you know, that's just a small price to pay for, you know, the authentic engagement, shall we say. But
I've turned off the carbon monoxide detector. I've unplugged all of the smoke alarms in the house, and, you know, I'm going to town. Go big or go home.
Right. Absolutely. Just make sure to follow all laws and regulations, but make sure that you are finding a very good place to burn that incense for sure. And Samuel as well. So that's awesome with the ritualistic praxis. You know, you're tracing this out. I think that really helps. I know for myself, for someone who's, you know, going into, you know, learning Sumerian and kind of engaging in these areas. And we do have a listener question for you from Jenica. And Jenica is asking and saying, my question for Samuel is, as a fan of his book, Lioness, does the Dumuzid book connect to this practice? And the book that's being referred to is one of your previous tomes, just an absolutely gorgeous tome, which is Lioness, the Song of Inanna, which has just these beautiful poetic invocations and ways that you can connect to Inanna, the goddess Inanna. To Jenica's question, Samuel, can you share with us about any connection between, obviously, your book, The Red Shepherd, and the Lioness book?
I would like to think that the Lioness book is the foray into what would eventually become this book about Dumuzid, because I do explore, as you know, Jenica would know, I do explore the numerous facets and aspects of Inanna or Ishtar in Lioness, and in that same manner, those same aspects or complementary aspects are explored in my book dedicated to Dumuzid. So I would like to think that they do complement each other. While the Red Shepherd is largely focused on him, there are elements within the book itself that do have rites. And in fact, one of the liturgical compositions, as you know, you read the manuscript and wrote the preface. One of the liturgical compositions is largely devoted to Inanna, because you, as the reader or the celebrant or the ritualist, are addressing her, you know, personally. You are directly addressing her, much in the way that one would address Inanna in my book, Lioness. So, you know, complementary texts, while one is directly, you know, devoted to Inanna, of course, the Red Shepherd being devoted to Dumuzid, they are quite complementary of each other, and the writing style and the material is largely similar.
Very nice. And definitely, listeners, make sure to check out the podcast and video description so that you can check out ways to not only pick up your own copy, but other ways that you can support Samuel's work. And Samuel, you were mentioning, we were both mentioning at the beginning of the podcast about Digital Hammurabi and the wonderful work that Megan and Josh do in learning Sumerian, which you are obviously, light years ahead of most. And
you're giving me too much credit there.
Like these are my note cards after, following Josh and Megan's book. And it's like,
oh my gosh,
I was joking that I think I started dreaming of Sumerian phrases like Lugal Kalaga and other phrases. But in the book, to that point, Lugal is the word for king in Sumerian, and you share in the book that one of the epithets ascribed to Dumuzid, to Tammuz, is, quote, Lugal Arali, meaning lord or king of the underworld. So can you share about what is the relationship, and you've touched on it a few times, between Dumuzid, Tammuz, and the shadowy underworld?
So what's interesting is we have this deity, we have this figure in myth and in religion, and many, of course, would ascribe specifically as a shepherd who, lives his life on the plains. But we have numerous texts, and in fact, one of them is an elegiac composition that commemorates the death of Ur-Namah, Ur-Namah being the king whose edicts and codified law actually precedes the codified laws that were essentially written or ascribed to the king Hammurabi. But within this composition of the death of Ur-Namah, there's specific, and it's not an illusion, it's not an inference, it's specifically stated that Dumuzid resides in the underworld, he has a throne, and what's interesting is he's actually mentioned before Nergal, next in line to Ereshkigal. So we find this fascinating parallel between the role that he has as the consort and spouse of Inanna, and what I'm not saying that he's the consort and spouse of Ereshkigal by any means, but we have this fascinating parallel where he is paired with Inanna as the goddess of heaven, the goddess of earth, and then we have him paired with Ereshkigal as, a regent of the underworld. What's interesting about this is, for those who are familiar with Hellenic myth and Hellenic texts and the whole milieu of the Hellenic peoples, Persephone, Aphrodite, and Adonis have this interesting relationship wherein Persephone wants Adonis to remain in the underworld with her, and relents and releases him periodically throughout the year to return to his lady lover Aphrodite. So I found that an interesting parallel. So we have this aspect of him in one culture, and then an analogous deity inhabiting a similar role in another. But more to this point, we have numerous instances where he is given offerings and petitioned. In fact, there are texts in which he is petitioned to take ghosts with him to the underworld when he descends. So he is a psychopomp in that regard. He's also petitioned to take sickness and disease from individuals who petition him when he descends into the underworld, because it was believed that that's where sickness and disease originated from the underworld. So people knew specifically that, hey, he's not only a shepherd, he's not only, Inanna's consort, he's also, my guy if I need assistance because I'm sick, or because, grumpy grandpa who didn't get his funerary offerings on time is hanging around and he needs to go back to the underworld. So it's so many different facets there that just astound me, that bewilder me, that bewitch me and beguile me. So
That's lovely, and this leads directly into the next question, Samuel, because it's something that you touch on in your book, The Red Shepherd. It's something Dr. Irving Finkel touched on in his book, The First Ghost, and when he was on the podcast, which is this necromantic magic relationship with a magician, someone who's seeking to access spirits, petition spirits, and someone who initially I didn't understand the connection, but after hearing you and Dr. Finkel, it makes so much more sense. The sun god Utu and the relationship between that god and the kind of spirits coming in and out of the underworld, because like the setting sun, Utu, who goes down into the underworld every single day at sunset, knew every single path that the spirits take to move up and down between the surface of the earth and the shadowy underworld. But in your book, you also trace out, this deep complexity, and you also share a petition to Utu for the aid of spirits. So can you just elaborate a little bit more on why Utu, the sun god, is so critical for a relationship with underworld spirits?
yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, he descends, at least within the comprehension that the Mesopotamians had of the whole, but he descends into the underworld to essentially hold court within the realm of the dead, and to pass judgments, to decree edicts. And he knows all the passages that lead into and out of the underworld. So it's like he is the all-seeing eye, if you will. And he is also petitioned in necromantic rites, specifically with ancestral rites, wherein an individual, say the head of the household, they need to figure out what's going to happen within the coming year, or they need to marry their daughter off, but they don't know who to marry her off to solidify ties between a family. So they will go to a priest or a necromancer, and they will get access to an ancestral skull, and the god would be petitioned to allow the spirit of the dearly departed to ascend from the underworld for a brief period of time, inhabit their skull, and answer questions by way of the medium. What's interesting is not only do we have that aspect, but in the myth of Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, Gilgamesh loses some personal items of his that invariably translated to a drum and a drumstick, a rod and a ring, various regalia items or toys, a man and his toys. So he's heartbroken that he's lost these things and that they've found their way into the underworld. So Enkidu, being Gilgamesh's BFF, is like, hey, chill, I'll go get them for you. And Gilgamesh says, well, in order for you to go, there are specific things that you cannot do. And of course, Enkidu is rather foolhardy, and he does those things that he's been told not to do. And for those who have read the Rod and Ring text, they will know what I'm referring to. So Enkidu goes into the underworld, and of course, he does what he's not supposed to do and ends up trapped. So he is now a spirit in the underworld. However, because Utu or Shamash has a particular amount of power over the spirits of the underworld, he allows Enkidu to rise up from the underworld and answer the questions that Gilgamesh has about the underworld and what happens to us when we die, and those who have gone on before that were Gilgamesh's loved ones, what's become of them. So it's interesting that we have the solar deity who has these deeply chthonic attributes and powers, who is petitioned to do so many wondrous things, and that's why he was included in this petition or in this ritual petition. And I wanted this to be included in Rod and Ring. However, it didn't seem like the home for it, if you will. It just seemed so out of place. And, as I'm writing this book, I'm like, well, Utu and Dumuzid or Shamash and Tammuz, they have this simpatico relationship. I've got to make sure that this ritual text finds a home in this book where it belongs, because it further expounds upon their relationship.
Yes, and I think readers will really appreciate that because of the context that you put it in, and also connecting the dots, especially as you mentioned with necromantic rites, magical rites, and also ancestral rites as well. And I think this next question, Samuel, leads directly to your point. You mentioned in your book, The Red Shepherd, that, quote, "The beings that I have come to understand as my familiar spirits have appeared in dreams and in ritual experiences over a period of several months before I made initial contact with them," unquote. So to that point, Samuel, can you share, in the Mesopotamian esoteric tradition, what is a familiar spirit? And then how can we cultivate those relationships with those spirits?
So I use familiar spirit because that's a term that, has specific connotations, within, biblical scripture and within traditional witchcraft. And to me, it strikes a chord. As far as the notion of a familiar spirit being at the beck and call of the historical practitioner, the priest, the magician, the exorcist, more often than not, the familiar spirit is a byproduct of that relationship that that individual would have, because they've been initiated into that tradition, whatever that tradition may be. So they know the names of the god, they know the attributes of the god, they have quote unquote knowledge of the god. That was a big thing in the time of these various Mesopotamian people, because those who quote unquote had no knowledge of the gods should not be engaging in this type of work. They shouldn't be privy to the material that's contained within a cuneiform tablet. So in this instance, the ritual relies more so on petitioning the god than it does to just address the spirits directly. And I found that, in the months prior to me actually, sitting down and figuring out the best way to write this ritual or to enact this ritual, all of these little bits and pieces were being given to me in the form of dreams. And, in one instance where, and I think I may have mentioned it, but I'm in the midst of pulling up carpet and the carpet's pulled up, the padding's pulled up, and I'm going through and pulling up every single nail that was used to hold the padding down. And as I'm doing it, the whole house is quiet. And I suddenly hear this voice just talking incredibly fast in my left ear. And I stopped and I was like, I'm having an oral hallucination. I am alone. There's no one else in the room with me. But everything that this voice was saying was coherent, despite the fact that they were talking so quickly. It was almost as though the voice was not used or was not accustomed to talking. But they spoke so quickly, and everything that was said, it was easily digestible, easily understood. So then I started writing the things that were revealed to me and, just let it sit. And then I had more of these quote unquote revelatory dreams where names were given, and I puzzled that out. In fact, at one point I was like, I messaged or posted in one of the Mesopotamian groups that I'm in, is anyone familiar with this name? I don't want to sound like a lunatic or woo, but this name came to me in a dream where a being said, my name is X, and the response was, no, that's not a name of a known deity or a known being, but the structure of that name is consistent with, the names of pretty much, theophoric names. And I really didn't think too much of it. I wrote the name down as I perceived it, went off on my merry way. And as I mentioned earlier, the individual that I consulted with to correct my translations or transliterations, my peer review expert, if you will, I gave him the names of these beings that were revealed to me, and he actually was able to essentially back translate or, place the names within the proper context and how they related to Utu or Shamash as the solar deity who can descend. So the rough translation to one of these spirits is essentially servant of radiance. And I found that incredibly fascinating. So it seemed to really hit home that what I was doing was not just, pulled out of thin air. And when I composed this ritual and performed this ritual, I specifically tied, I'm not one for, following planetary hours or, astrological positions. Because I don't want to say it's largely out of my purview or outside of my purview, but it's not something that fits within my praxis, because my praxis is more devotional, liturgical, more theurgy than thaumaturgy. And I thought, you know what? The moon's going to be in Gemini. Let's do this on a Sunday in the hour of the sun, and we'll see how it goes. We're just going to enact this text, all this material that has come to me, and the source material that I was able to find. We'll just see what happens. And I go out to the prairie. You've been to this prairie as well. We've walked on this beautiful prairie, and I'm with two other individuals, one of whom is incredibly skeptical. And we're standing at a crossroads where the prairie paths meet. And this is a space that we've done ritual in the past with the local group that was active at the time. And I recite the text. I provide the customary or requisite offerings. I petition the god. And at the very end, when I ask for a sign or symbol of their presence, I didn't get anything. And I waited for a while. And I thought, okay, well, I guess it's just, it's time to just pack up and leave. And in that moment where I started to dismantle the altar, I caught this shape out of the corner of my eye. And where I'm standing, I'm in the middle of the crossroads, and then there's the path ahead of me that goes, through the prairie and then up to the parking lot and the ziggurat of the area that you have also been to. And I look up, and this buck is running down the path, and I watch it with my eyes, and it just leaps into the prairie grass to my right and takes off into the forest. And I just stopped what I was doing and thought, well, I'm going to take this as a sign. And I'm going to leave these offerings now. And I'm going to go about my day knowing that this happened and that there were witnesses that saw this happen. So I'm not crazy.
Well, I think that's so lovely because it goes directly both that experience with the buck and then also, when you were pulling out nails from the floor and all of a sudden you hear this voice, so close to you. Is it fair to say that that really is a key aspect about being receptive and really being open to this kind of communication? Because I would think that a lot of people who might be familiar with, the grimoire tradition or other traditions, there's this mindset of, okay, it's kind of a one-way thing. Like, I'm going to go in, I will invoke and intone the appropriate names and engage with spirits. But what you're sharing is the opposite. Instead of at the most unexpected times, being receptive is just as important. Would that be fair?
It would definitely say that that is fair. And, it also, I think it's also contingent upon the fact that some people are quote unquote wired a certain way. And I think a lot of it also has to do with one's upbringing. So as I'd mentioned, in my previous interview with you, I grew up Pentecostal, and within the Pentecostal sect of Christianity, spirit interactions were a daily thing. Like, there is an unseen spiritual world where spirits are doing warfare and they can influence events, and we can see them if we're operating in the power of the Holy Spirit. And while I'm no longer Christian, I no longer identify as Christian, obviously, because I'm writing books about evil deities who were worshipped as an abomination unto the Lord. I'm also having these spiritual experiences that are being validated because I'm, at the time, quote unquote, operating in the gifts of the Spirit. And people may denigrate that, but that is, at its heart, a form of Christian magic. That is accessing the unseen. It may not necessarily fall in line with Western ceremonial tradition or what others would perceive as a magical working, but it is largely the same in that it is attempting to access that spiritual world. And I think that this is just one of those moments where I don't want to say I was in a meditative state because of just the repetitive action, but I was essentially maybe checked out, if you will, just kind of caught up in the moment. And that's what allowed this to happen, or allowed me to be in a receptive state. And I found that this is something that is not a random occurrence. This is something that I've experienced ever since I was a small child. And it was just easily explained that it's because the Holy Spirit was revealing things to me, or, I was operating in the spirit realm. And I guess now I'm operating in a spirit realm, but going about it in a different manner.
Yes, in fact, I don't know if the buck, or just being receptive, or hearing that voice, that experience, will be the answer to this next question, but perhaps, because one of the ones was, when you were researching and writing this, what was one of the most surprising things that you found out in your research, in the process of writing it? I mean, clearly being very receptive there, but were there any other big surprises or things in the research realm or in the writing realm that really struck you as you were putting this together?
As far as the book as a whole, or
absolutely.
Yeah, the book as a whole, and this is going to sound weird, but this is a phenomenon, if you will, that another friend of mine has shared with me, because they've been doing a great deal of research about the diffusion of Inanna, or Ishtar's cult, and how it, traveled from east to west, and then even in some instances from the Middle East to the Far East, at least in the sense of symbols and various epithets. And they found that during the course of their research, it was as though they were able to reconcile their former Christian identity, because this spiritual current that was woven through their research as a devotee, but also as an academic, was actually reconciling these disparities, and they found themselves in a sense, or in a state of Marian devotion. And I thought that was incredibly fascinating, because as I was doing the research and doing a deep dive and really disregarding my personal sentiments, because I wanted to be as objective as possible, at least within the context of my research. I mean, my finished book is is largely experiential. But within the context of the research that I was doing, I could not help but find myself drawn to the figure of Christ in the New Testament, in the Synoptic Gospels, and in the Gnostic texts, because of the numerous epithets that Christ possesses. I mean, we see these memes where this notion is being put forth, and this is all coming from the Zeitgeist film that came out, 10 years ago or something. How this figure of Christ is not a new phenomenon. We've got all of these different iterations, and while that is muddling or muddying the waters, there is credence there. And I found myself counting all of these various epithets and these various attributes that were ascribed to Dumuzid and gods like him within Mesopotamia, and they trickled and found their way, and were culturally diffused into the Levant and into Galilee and Jerusalem and all of these various parts of the Levant and Palestine. And I just thought, this is too much of a coincidence for me to suddenly find myself drawn back to Christ. It was almost like, I don't know, a Mobius strip, if you will. And we have his epithets, Christ's epithets, as the bridegroom. Dumuzid is the bridegroom. We have him as the shepherd. That's an obvious one. One of Dumuzid's aspects is also a fisherman. There was a king, historical king, at least referred to in the Sumerian kings list, who was known as Dumuzid the fisherman. So we have Christ as the fisher of men. And that, of course, is subject to interpretation there. It's probably just me, doing some magical math. But the fact remains, there are numerous instances where, these epithets, these terms, these aspects are so analogous, and it's just, I don't want to say it's incomprehensible. I'm going back to the word bewildering. So in a way, and in fact, I also mentioned this in the book, there is, or was, an early Assyriologist by the name of Hugo Radow, who wrote that the Sumerians were grasping in the dark for the figure of Christ, and they realized that figure in the form of Dumuzid, or Tammuz. And of course, he's writing from, despite the fact that he is an academic, he's writing from the standpoint that, the Bible is a historical document, and looking at early archaeology as a means to legitimize the material that's found in the Bible. So, as I'm reading that, and I had never heard of him before, and I read that and I was like, okay, this is not true, but it resonated with me at such a deep level that I actually, for a while, I had to stop my research, because I was like, it's not that I was uncomfortable. It was that I did not know how to reconcile what I was reading with the, it's outdated material, but there was something about what I was reading that really struck a chord with me. And it's not like it dredged up my quote unquote Christian trauma or Christian baggage, or, I was suddenly unable to deconstruct that former Christian identity. But it really struck a chord in me in the sense that it was never Christ when I was a Christian, or when I, eventually left Christianity. It was never Christ that I had a problem with. And I guess even to this day, I can while I'm not a Christian, while I haven't been to church in years, I can still appreciate the figure of Christ in the way he is presented within the synoptic gospels. I mean, we get into Revelation where he's, coming with the sword in his mouth. But then again, there's also an interesting parallel there, because in the book of Revelation, he is the bridegroom who has come for his unblemished bride, his spotless bride, and he is given incredibly martial attributes. He's a sword that comes out of his mouth. He possesses a sword. He judges the nations. And, as I'm thinking back on that, I'm just like, again, I mentioned I had to step away from my research. I had to put it on hold and really take a step back and think something's got to give. So that's when I decided that if I need to get serious about this, I need to give Dumuzid more of my time and attention, because within the context of my praxis in the beginning, my devotion to my personal pantheon, Inanna was the first to receive, that devotion when I formally organized my temple space, and Dumuzid was kind of relegated to, a second or tertiary role. And as I'm, doing this research, and then I have this moment of cognitive dissonance, I thought the only way that I'm going to be able to get centered is if I give him more of his due, not just in writing this book, but also in continuing to embody a practice and, giving him his requisite offerings on a regular basis instead of, during the new moon or the full moon. And I found that in doing that, it provided me with the momentum to compile this text in a coherent manner, to finish this text in a coherent manner. And it's like this text is, I don't want to say divine providence, but the synchronicities that happened after that, it suddenly went from, well, this is pre-existing material that was supposed to be in the Rod and Ring, but now it's a whole other beast. It's taken on a life of its own. We're going to let this happen. We're going to see where this goes. And, here it is.
Yeah. And that's so wonderful. A very organic, kind of evolutionary process. And it's wonderful to see that blossom in the Red Shepherd. And actually, in terms of the similarities, as you were mentioning, between Dumuzid and Christ, this kind of goes to the next question. And you brought this up on our last podcast interview about misconceptions with Mesopotamian esotericism and things that maybe people might assume about Mesopotamian esotericism that are not necessarily true. So I guess in light of the Red Shepherd, Samuel, can you share with us a little bit about what are some of the misconceptions about Tammuz or Dumuzid that you really just want readers, as they go through your book, to keep in mind, or misconceptions that you challenge and that you really break those misconceptions about this deity?
A, he was not just a shepherd, first and foremost. And B, he is complementary to Inanna in every single way, in his role as a martial deity, in his role as a deity who transcends dimensions, who, is in heaven, is on earth, and is in the underworld. And what's also interesting is I do want to emphasize that this god, like all gods throughout the world, throughout history, regardless of their mythology, each god's cult diverges from mythology in every way, shape, or form. Because if we solely look at a god through the lens of their mythology alone, we are missing this rich tapestry of how this god was perceived, how this god was worshipped, how this god was approached by their devotees, their supplicants, their worshipers, their priests, their priestesses. So you have these deities that are incredibly complex, that are incredibly enriched by their cultic practices that surrounded them. So you have Odin, you have Thor, who they're myths alone. They don't just embody their myths. They embody their worship, their cultic practice, the evolution of that cultic practice that echoes throughout time, that evolved as their worship was carried into the British Isles and into land Europe, or vice versa. You have the goddess Aset, or Isis, who became this incredible powerhouse in the Hellenic world. So yes, Dumuzid is a shepherd. Yes, the book is the Red Shepherd, but he is so many of these things. And what my biggest gripe, what really grinds my gears, is when we take these powerful beings, these intelligences, these gods, these archetypes, if you're the psychological model, we take these beings, we declaw them, we put them in cages, and we ignore all of their complexities. What do you have in that instance? You have a shabby lion in a cage who has no claws, who has no teeth. You're just feeding them mush, and they become a shell of themselves. They're not even, a shell of themselves. They're a shadow. I don't want people to approach Dumuzid or his constellation of deities in that same manner. We're all multifaceted beings as humans. The gods are multifaceted as well. We need to acknowledge that. They're just as ugly as they are beautiful, and they possess their antithesis. So
that's lovely. And restoring that complex tapestry is, I know, something that readers can really walk away with in reading your book, The Red Shepherd. And Samuel, just as we wrap up, I know we have one after show question for patrons, but for the main part of the podcast here, definitely listeners, check out the podcast and video descriptions to pick up your own copy of The Red Shepherd. But can you share with us, Samuel, you're always researching, always thinking about something. How can listeners support your work? Can you share a little bit about your website? And then can you share about just what you're thinking about, what your future projects might be?
Sure. So my website is rodandring.com or rodandring.wordpress.com. It's been, I don't want to say inactive, but it's not received the love and attention that it should, since I am an author and have a presence in the online world. Of course, I'm also on Facebook as Samuel David. I have a Facebook page which started out as the Facebook page for the temple that I'm the steward of, but then it evolved into Order of the Rod and Ring, and now it's just Rod and Ring, Ancient Near East meets Modern West, where I elaborate upon, or at least present material that kind of elaborates upon the Ancient Near East and how its currents are affecting the Western world in which we inhabit. Also on Instagram, at Rod and Ring. I was on TikTok, but TikTok wasn't for me because, well, as we all know, TikTok is a fiery mess. It is a dumpster fire going down a river in a collapsed building. And I do have Twitter, but I'm not active on Twitter. That's also at Rod and Ring. You can tell I've cornered the market as far as marketing and branding goes. I did have a Patreon, but I decided to take that down because I don't know. It wasn't for me.
Future projects, what you're thinking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the Whispers in the Wind. There is a project that I will be working on with Shea Belay. And the reason why this, and it's so uncharacteristic of me, as many would assume so anyway. While I'm not a Luciferian, while I'm not a practitioner of left-hand path philosophies or traditions, I do find them fascinating. And what I find fascinating is how the Mesopotamian spiritual current is presented within the context of the left-hand path subculture. And unfortunately, I find in many instances that the way it's portrayed, the way it's presented, is not consistent with culture, history, liturgical texts, magical texts. Like the whole milieu is largely skewed, and that's something that Shay and I have talked about for so long. And I firmly believe, and I fully support this, I firmly believe that, and again, I'm not a member of the left-hand path community or the satanic community, but I firmly believe that members of the left-hand path community, members of the satanic community, Luciferians as a whole, whatever the case may be, I firmly believe that they want to be divested from the Christian sphere and have a spirituality that is not contingent upon a Christian current. So the answer to that is, well, let's look back as far as we can. We come to Mesopotamia, we have all of these demons and these spirits and these gods that kind of speak to that darkness, that antinomian nature. But the Mesopotamians were not antinomian. And a lot of the gods and the spirits that are elevated were, like in the case of Tiamat, or essentially plot devices. And that's no, I'm not casting any dispersion or denigrating anyone who has a devotional praxis to Tiamat, or approaches her in some sort of devotional manner, because we have these instances where tulpas take on meaning. We have gods who respond to names that were ascribed to other beings, or spirits that respond to names that are ascribed to other beings. But I want to present the material, the source material that so many draw from, in its context, without denigrating them. And that's a project that Shane and I want to work on, him approaching it as someone who is in that culture, and me approaching it as someone who is on the outside looking in, who has an appreciation for people of that culture, and am drawn to it. As one other friend said, Satan's always whispering seductively into our ears. And that's another thing, even within the course of this research, where with all of these various epithets and aspects of Dumuzid, and as I had mentioned within the myth of Adapa, there's these Luciferian elements of Dumuzid as well. We have him as the son of Enki being described in texts as the goat of the Abzu, or the goat of the abyss. I mean, these are names that obviously resonate with members of the left-hand path community for a reason. So, it's not so much me trying to, tell people what they should or should not do, but I want to present the material and say, look, here's more ways to enrich your praxis. If this is your philosophy, if this is the spiritual light, black flame that has drawn you in. And I do that, as I believe, as I perceive it to be, as a service to my spiritual community, as a service to neighboring spiritual communities, but also as a service and an act of devotion to the gods that I am devoted to the gods that I worship, to the gods that, have a prominent place in my temple pantheon, to the gods who have drawn me out of the sheepfold and taken me out of the temple of the Christian God into their own temples and invited me in and have enriched my life in so many incomprehensible ways.
Well, that's lovely, and I think a really good kind of guiding Northern Star on the excellent research and really the kind of purpose that you approach this, not only in your previous writings, but of course with the Red Shepherd. Samuel David, Mesopotamian polytheist, an artist, a writer, a researcher, an educator who's based in the Midwest, has been sharing about from Anathema Publishing, his latest tome, The Red Shepherd, about the god, this complex, fascinating god, Tammuz or Dumuzid. Samuel, as always, just thank you so much for taking a little bit of time and sharing your wisdom on the podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you again for having me, Alex. It's great to see you, and as always, it's great to chat with you and get my voice and my message, if you will, the Mesopotamian gospel out there. And of course, I'm always amenable to messages and to communication that anyone wants to initiate with me. So if you also want to contact me by email, rodandring@gmail.com. And of course, don't ask me for money because, I'm an author and I'm poor.